On April 12th of 2012, I opened the best email that I have ever received. But before I tell you what it said, I want to tell you about a man named Bob Kern. Bob was born in 1925 in Osage, Iowa, with a fascination for engines. As a kid, if it had gears or pistons or combustions, Bob wanted to know how it worked. And that passion led him to study mechanical engineering at the University of Illinois. After graduating in 1947, he landed a job at a motor company in Wisconsin designing engine generators for railway passenger cars. But then when jet airlines took over and trains started to kind of lose their edge, his entire division was shut down and Bob found himself unemployed. Now, many people would have gone and just started applying elsewhere, but Bob was not your average guy. Instead, in 1959, he and his wife, Patricia, rented a garage and started their own company. They called it Generac Power Systems. Their breakthrough was a lightweight portable generator, and Bob had built a better mousetrap. Over the next few decades, Generac exploded in success, but Bob didn't just love engines. Bob also loved Jesus, and as much as he loved Jesus, he also hated watching pastors and church leaders pay a lot to be trained and educated, only to get paid little in ministry and struggle under debt for years. And so in 2006, when Bob sold Generac, Bob did something radical. Instead of hoarding the proceeds for himself, he took all of that money, which was close to $1 billion, and he started the Kern Family Foundation to pay for pastors and missionaries to be trained and educated. So on April 16th of 2012, I opened an email. It was an email that told me that every penny of my 3-year seminary education would be paid for in full, courtesy of Bob Kern. At 17 years old, I had a call into ministry. At 21 years old, I entered into ministry debt-free. That is an uncommon story made possible because of uncommon generosity. And if God is at work bringing his kingdom to earth as it is in heaven, then the question for us today is this: how can we, as his people, make uncommon generosity more common? We are in week 2 of a 3-week series studying the New Testament letter of 3rd John. Most scholars think that the Apostle John wrote this letter as a series of 3 letters that we find in our New Testament, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. In fact, we have covered 1st John and 2nd John earlier this year, and if you want to go back and listen to the teaching through those books, you can. But by the way, I love this. This is, John's pretty clear on his like themes through his letters, and so he's like, sermon on joy, faith, love, and then Ian's like Antichrist right there, like just nestled in, that's actually a great sermon. You should go back and listen to that. But you can listen to the whole lot, okay? And 3rd John is actually the shortest book in the entire Bible. Just 1 chapter, 15 verses. And so if you ever want to brag and be like, I've memorized an entire book of the Bible, 3rd John is a great place to start, just saying, all right? And so in this letter, John, as Ian said last week, is writing to a friend of his named Gaius, who is a fellow believer in a different town. And his letter includes encouragement and challenge and warning, because good friends do all 3 of those things. And so, at the beginning of this letter, he begins this way, and this is the passage that Ian preached from last week. He says, "The elder," he's referring to himself, "to my dear friend Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health, and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well. It gave me great joy when some believers came and testified about your faithfulness to the truth, telling me how you continue to walk in it. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth." So the first few verses, you see John is commending Gaius for his commitment to the truth. And that's because he knows it's possible, even if you start in the truth, to kind of stray into false teaching, to wrong teaching, which is a dangerous place to live. And then John goes on to say this, and this is the 4 verses that make up the middle section of the letter, which is where we're going to park today. He said, "Dear friend, you are faithful in what you are doing for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. They have told the church about your love. Please send them on their way in a manner that honors God. It was for the sake of the name that they went out, receiving no help from the pagans. We ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together for the truth." In just a few verses, John gives a masterclass in how the church is to stand in contrast to the rest of the world. Here he gives 3 identity markers that characterize the church. And these identity markers can be found throughout the entire New Testament. In fact, they're so prevalent that they make up 3 of our 7 values that we champion here at the Bridge, values that define our culture, who we are. And you can see the full list on our website, but here are the 3 that we're going to highlight that emerge from our passage today. This is who we are. At the Bridge, we don't say, when people walk through our doors, "Where have you been?" We say, "Welcome home." We don't live with closed fists. We live with open hands. And we don't create weekend spectators. We equip everyday disciples. So we're going to pack each of these one at a time. So starting with the first one. John says, "Dear friend, you are faithful in what you're doing for the brothers and sisters, even though they're strangers to you. They have told the church about your love." So here John makes a shift from the first part of his letter. He's talking about truth to now talking about love. So in Christian tradition, there's always been this synergy between what's known as orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Okay, so orthodoxy is right belief, and orthopraxy is right action. Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy, "Watch your life and doctrine closely." It's a great verse because it's basically a summary of Christian faithfulness. Watch your doctrine. Make sure to always stay within the bounds of good theology rooted in Scripture. Stay rooted. Watch your doctrine. And also, watch your life. Make sure that your behavior is consistently in keeping with faithfulness to God and actually looks like becoming more like Jesus. Watch your doctrine. Watch your life. And here, John is commending Gaius. He's saying, "I see you demonstrating both orthodoxy and orthopraxy. You are committed to both truth and love." Ian said it great last week. He said, "Truth without love is harsh. Love without truth is hollow." Because the reality is you can be right and also be a jerk. But you can also have affection and kindness and empathy towards people, but if you are never somebody who corrects or holds up a mirror, then that's kind of love that's hollow. So truth without love is harsh, love without truth is hollow, but truth and love together are holy. These two work together to reflect the heart of God. And in the New Testament, it's really important to note that love is always, always seen in action. Love does things. And by the way, I don't care what they say, and I don't care what you heard. The word love is a verb. I got one guy, okay. My one DC Talk fan. Those of you who are like under 30 are like, what is happening right now? Okay. Biblical love always has particular action attached to it, and we see that here as well. Okay, so John is describing how Gaius' love has been demonstrated tangibly. He says that Gaius loves people that he has never met before. He has treated them like brothers and sisters, strangers welcomed as siblings. Gaius is living out this marker of the church. We don't say, "Where have you been?" We say, "Welcome home." In 2019, some friends of ours, when we were living in Illinois, their names are Dan and Laura, adopted a young boy from Bulgaria. And it was a long and arduous process, as those international adoption stories can often go. But the day finally came when it was time for him to leave this crowded orphanage in Bulgaria and fly across the world, all because Dan and Laura had bent over backwards to make sure that this one boy would never again be neglected or overlooked. And to celebrate, it was so fun. They invited a bunch of family members and friends to the airport to welcome him and sort of party. And so like 25 of us crowded into the international terminal at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and we had signs and balloons and stuff and just waited for this boy to arrive. And we had never met him before. We had never met him, but we knew that when he was going to come off that plane, he would come off with a new last name. He had gone from stranger to family simply because our friends set their love on this boy, pursued him for years, and sacrificed to give him a new name. In fact, many of us in the crowd at the airport that day, sitting there holding signs, we had never met each other before that day. But if you were standing in the airport watching this happen, you never would have guessed that. You would have guessed that we'd known each other for a long time. And that's because all of us there held something deep in common, and that's that we belonged to Jesus. We all knew what it was like to be estranged from God and yet pursued in love. We all knew what it was like to be called by name and brought into a new family. And in that sense, even though none of us had met before, we all, because we belonged to Christ, also belonged to each other. So John begins this section of his letter by simply encouraging Gaius in what he's already doing. He's saying, Gaius, you've been faithful. The word has gotten back to me about what you're doing, and it is holy gossip, right? Rumors are going around about you, and they are good rumors. People are talking about your love for brothers and sisters in Christ that you don't even know. He's saying, Gaius, I'm so proud of you. This is one of the things I hear most often when I talk to people who are new to our church, by the way. I often talk to people who go through open house, which if you haven't been through open house, it's a wonderful introductory environment to let you know who we are. But we ask people, hey, what brought you to the bridge? But I also like asking the question, what brought you back to the bridge? Not the first time, but the second time. And the answer almost always is tied back to some version of, I just felt so welcome. In fact, this is one of the things that stood out to me when I first came on staff, and I would talk to members of our connection team. This is our street to seat team, parking, the people who are braving the elements, out there today, in 20-degree weather, all the way to our first-time guest tent, to our coffee team, to ushers and greeters. And I would talk to people on this connections team, and I'd say, how long have you been serving on the team? And I would get answers like 3 weeks, 6 weeks. How long have you been coming to the bridge? 3 weeks. I'm like, what? And I would say, why'd you jump into serving so quickly? And the answer was almost always the same, as I wanted to be a part of the team that made me want to come back to the bridge. I love that. So I just want to say, just as John said to Gaius, at church family, I am so proud of you for the ways that this is being lived out as a value here at the church. It is not just something that's a poster on a wall. We truly do say, welcome home. By no means are we perfect. Right? Sometimes we fall short. But by and large, y'all are really living this out well. And it is evidence of God's kindness and the Spirit's work in our midst that showing hospitality to the stranger who walks through these doors is in many ways second nature. And I also want to say, if you walked in today as a stranger, no matter the kind of day or week or decade you have had, no matter where you have been, I want to say welcome home. We're really, really glad that you're here. Yeah? John then goes on to say this. He says, please send them, he's talking about the believers that Gaius had welcomed, send them on their way in a manner that honors God. It was for the sake of the name that they went out, receiving no help from the pagans. So it's in these couple verses that we get a little bit more insight into the situation of the brothers and sisters that John is talking about. So they're not just fellow Christians. It turns out they are traveling missionaries. So they came to Gaius as strangers, and Gaius welcomed them as family because they were, in fact, brothers and sisters in Christ. But we find out they're not going to be staying long. Soon they're going to be on the move again. And the reason that they're traveling is for the sake of the name. It's to share the good news about Jesus. See, from the very beginning, the church has always had missionaries because we believe, unashamedly, that the gospel is good news that actually has the power to change eternities. And so if you come here, like every weekend, you'll see almost always some high schooler wearing a shirt that says the phrase, till the whole world knows. And there's a Bible verse on it. It's Acts chapter 1, verse 8, which says, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. In this one verse, Jesus describes how some disciples are called here, others near, and others far. But all of us are on the same team, sharing the same message until the whole world knows. And so ever since Jesus' resurrection, there have been missionaries, people who feel called to spend a season or maybe even their entire life doing what you might call dedicated gospel-advancing work. But that also means that from the beginning, the church has also had the responsibility to tangibly support these kinds of people. And this is where we see the second hallmark of the church emerge in John's letter. The church is a place where we do not live with closed fists. We live with open hands. I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing on April 16th of 2012 when I opened that email that I mentioned. Maybe you had an experience like that where you got big news and you're like, I can vividly remember what was happening. That was me. So I was at dinner with a guy that was getting dinner with him for the very first time. I was 21 years old, brand new to a church ministry job, and I had no idea what I was doing. And so my only instinct was I got to find a mentor, somebody who's like has a little bit more experience. And so this guy in my church had been in ministry for decades, and I said, can I buy you dinner and just pick your brain and have you give me some advice? And he said, absolutely. And so we sit down, and we're having burgers, and like 10 minutes in, I feel my phone buzz, and I look down, and I just see the subject line of the email, and it just says scholarship decision. And so I look up and I go, hey, Tim, I don't usually do this, especially with people I've just met, but here's the situation. I kind of tell him about the fact that I've applied for the scholarship and I think this is the email. And he said, oh, by all means, go look at the email. And so I open it up. And like I said, here's the, oh, by the way, I said, is it too late to pray for this? Like, I was like, I want, like my instinct is like to pray, but it's already in my inbox. And he goes, it depends on how generous you think God is with your prayers. And I'll never forget that line. And so I open up this email and it says, you've gotten this scholarship. And so we celebrate and then continue to eat burgers and actually get to know each other. And so he's like, hey, tell me about yourself. So I told him about my family background and whatever. And he said, tell me about your wife. And I said, my wife's, her name's Kasia, and she actually grew up as a missionary kid in a missionary family in Europe. And he said, oh, where in Europe? I said, just outside of Budapest in Hungary. And he goes, I've spent some time there. Where exactly was she? It's like a little town called Diósd. It's a suburb of Budapest. And he goes, what was the name of the school she went to? And I said, well, not that you care, but it's a little tiny Christian school called International Christian School of Budapest, ICSB. And he goes, I was part of the team that helped start that school in the early 90s. And I'm like, here I am in Geneva, Illinois, eating burgers with this guy whose story intersected with my wife's family story decades ago, right? So here's my point. When John challenges Gaius to go above and beyond in tangibly supporting missionaries, this is actually a verse that hits close to home because this is my wife's story. This is how she grew up. Kasia's family spent 25 years going from India to Romania and eventually settling in Hungary. So for 2 decades, they lived out this call that God had on their life to go far and wide, going from place to place and living in the same sort of courageous vulnerability and dependence that these traveling missionaries had to live in, that Gaius had welcomed into his home. And I call it courageous vulnerability because, as John says here in his letter, many missionaries go out and they receive no help from the pagans. And by pagans, he just means non-Christians. So John is just saying, hey, we can't expect non-Christians to support Christian work. And of course we shouldn't, right? We shouldn't expect that because gospel work is just different than charity work. It certainly includes meeting tangible physical needs, but it goes beyond that, doesn't it? It goes beyond that to meet spiritual needs with a very specific message. And so we need people who will go far and wide with this explicit goal of making Jesus known. And that means that when we send people out, non-Christians are not going to have a sort of eagerness to jump on that project and support it. Because of this, those who feel called to gospel work depend on the church actually being a people who live with open hands and not closed fists. And this sort of providing goes beyond receiving them when they come to us. John says to Gaius, please send them on their way in a manner that honors God. And that phrase, send them on their way, it's actually a really technical term that was used in the early church that referred to providing safe passage and resources and even money to traveling missionaries and ministers. So according to John, generous hospitality means that we don't just take care of people when they're under our roof or in our company, but we send people out with stomachs full and even bags full. And when we do this, John says we honor God, which means this: generosity is a form of worship. Generosity is an act of worship. God is glorified not just when we gather for songs and sermons, but also when we gather for soup and sourdough, right? When we intentionally make more than enough and invest in Tupperware and tinfoil, and we send people out of our house with food for the road. That's the kind of generous hospitality the church has practiced for 2,000 years. We have been a community, a people who live not with closed fists, but with open hands. And this leads John to his last comment to Gaius about these missionaries, where he says that his small acts of hospitality actually add up and participate in a much bigger story. He says, we ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together for the truth. When John says we ought, make no mistake, he is saying this is a command for all believers and not just some people. By all accounts, Gaius was just an ordinary dude who committed to living generously with whatever resources God had given him. There's no indication that he's a pastor or missionary or church leader. He's just a regular guy. But being a regular guy for him, he knew, meant that it was not a life sitting on the sidelines. John tells him that when we tangibly give towards gospel advancement, we become co-laborers with those people who are doing that work. We work together for the truth. And this is where we see the third value emerge from John's letter. We don't create weekend spectators. We create everyday disciples. Some of you will become the kind of missionaries that Gaius welcomed into his home. You will travel to places far and wide to see the gospel go where it has never gone before. And I just want to say, if that is you, that is a noble task. Listen to God's voice if he's calling you, and we will send you with blessing. But the majority of us will not be called to that kind of work. The majority of us will be called to live faithfully as people who are integrated into the neighborhoods and the workplaces and the schools where God has already placed us. But that does not mean that you are a spectator. You are an essential part of the church. You have a role to play. And this is what's behind our vision for every table here at the Bridge. When Jesus put on flesh, it was very apparent that his mission was the gospel, but his method was the table. And the beautiful thing about a table, of course, is it's something that every single one of us has. Maybe it's not a mistake that Jesus used the table to do so much good. And so our vision is to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, to bring the gospel to every table. That is our vision. Whether it's our dinner table or the cafeteria table at school, whether it is the changing table or an operating table, whether it is the boardroom table or the break room table. If God is calling you to what you might call vocational ministry, go. But if he is not, that is okay. That is not for everyone, but all of us are called to be a part of this work somehow. And for most of us, it's gonna mean tangibly supporting that work. So what does that look like? Here is where I wanna get just really practical with us. Kind of give you a glimpse into how we operate as a church. In case you didn't know, the Bridge only exists because Christ followers are generous. In case you weren't aware, this is not a government-funded operation, okay? Mission movement speeds up when people are generous. Mission movement slows down when people are not. So I want to talk to you about two main buckets that we have here at the Bridge. The first is our general fund. Put simply, the general fund allows us to have spaces, ministries, and staff. Without spaces, it's really hard to meet. This is where we gather every single Sunday. It allows us to have ministries. So when you think of like Bridge Kids happening in the building, when you think of Bridge students gathering on a Wednesday night or Sunday night for Columbia, when you think of Bridge groups that gather and scatter throughout our community every single week, these ministries are made possible because they draw from the general fund. And lastly, the general fund allows us to staff these ministries. We have a staff that, at least in this season, are called not to the marketplace, but to the local church, where they lead the ministries of our church. And we have some phenomenal staff, by the way. I just want to say, any one of our staff could go get a different job and make a bunch more money, but they are here because they love the local church and they are sold on the mission of the Bridge. And additionally, you may not know this, but 10% of our general fund always goes to support missions work. This budget allows us to support a variety of ministries both here and around the world. And so just like many people make a practice of giving 10% of their income to the local church, we, as a local church, turn around and say, we're gonna give 10% of our income to make sure that missions work happens outside of our walls. And so the reason we partner with Christian organizations, by the way, you might see kind of a list on our website of different people have different emphases. The reason we do that is because we have no interest in reinventing the wheel. There are many, many ministries that they are masters at what they do. And so instead of reinventing the wheel and having 1,000 different ministries under our roof, we identify and vet different organizations or people that are called to a particular lane of gospel work, who are very dialed into doing that really well, and we come alongside them and resource them. And that often looks like sending volunteers to help serve, but it also means just cutting checks so that that ministry can continue to flourish. Locally, this budget is what allows us to be in Murray and Perry County Jail. It's what allows us to fund pregnancy centers and food pantries and faith-based organizations that help kids who've experienced trauma, and the list just goes on and on. Globally, this fund allows us to support gospel work that's happening in places like Guatemala and Zambia. And by the way, we have teams right now that are getting ready to go in June to do mission work in both of those places. As you heard earlier today, Later this month, on the 22nd, we're going to be gathering in this space to pack 100,000 meals to go to support families who are impoverished in Lusaka, Zambia. And with those meals, we'll go gospel proclamation because our partner on the ground, Family Legacy, will ensure that people's mouths are fed, but also their souls are fed. That's the kind of work that they do. So that's all the general fund, okay? So that's number one. The second one, that's the big bucket, is our Every Table Fund, at least in this season. This is our 3-year initiative that's designed to pour fuel on the fire of this vision that we have to bring the gospel to every table. The 2 main initiatives is to give our Columbia campus a permanent location after 6 years of setup and teardown, and it is underway. We have renovations happening as we speak. And the second is to build out unfinished square footage here in the Spring Hill area because go talk to one of our student ministry team members or our kids ministry team members and they'll say, we are maxed out, especially in the morning. We need more space. And so we are creating spaces all so that people can gather, be captivated by the vision of Jesus, and see the tables that they have in their lives as the best gospel sharing tools that they have. That's what's behind all this. But all this takes real resources, born out of real generosity. And because we want to be good stewards, we want to be able to cash flow all of this without taking on any additional debt. That's our heart. And so here's the reality. God is already moving, friends, in really amazing and powerful ways through the generosity of this church. But today I also want to invite you into something bigger, not just a response of like, how am I using my money, but how am I shaping my life? We are committed to be in a church where radical generosity is not a rare thing to see. We want to be a church where uncommon generosity is commonplace because generosity is not just a campaign to finish, it is a life that we are called to live. And we will miss the mark, hear me clearly, if we meet all of our financial goals and yet we have a family of people that are motivated by guilt or fear or pride. That's missing the mark. But at the same time, vision often moves faster than resources. And right now, we see an opportunity to step more and more into greater generosity as a church family. And so here's the cool thing. Just to put a really specific number on it, we sat down and did the math. And if every family who calls the Bridge home gave $9 a week for the next year, we could completely fund our general fund and all remaining dollars of our Every Table initiative. That's just the reality of it. Now, as I say that, it is worth saying that for some of you, this is your very first day at the Bridge, and you're like, what did I walk into today, okay? I just want to say, if that is you, this is not for you. Consider this service as our gift to you, okay? Also, some of you are in really, really tight financial situations for one reason or another, right? Maybe it's a disaster hit, maybe it's you're between jobs, and this is a season where you're waiting for the next thing to come, and maybe you're even in a season of needing to receive help from the generosity of people in this church family. And if that's you, that is okay. But for many of us, today is a good opportunity to take stock and reevaluate. Maybe you've been coming into the Bridge for a little while now, but you have not given to the general fund, to every table, to see our mission move forward. And maybe today is a day for your first step. For others, maybe who've been coming for a while, we are giving, but maybe it's not sacrificial giving. Maybe God today is calling you into a deeper life of open-handedness, not out of obligation, but out of seeing the opportunity that is right in front of us, that he is saying, it's right there, go take it. You can see all of this and kind of double click on everything that I've talked about at bridge.tv/generosity. But here's what I want to say. I love being at the Bridge for this reason. We are not kept by vision. We are not kept up by, I believe God has given us a big vision. Every table is a big vision. It literally can't get any bigger. We're talking about every table. And so we have our work cut out for us. It's right there. The only limitation for a vision like that will ever be resources. And hear me, we will be faithful with whatever we have. And God will use whatever we have. But if you are planting roots here at the Bridge, if you are sold on this vision, then today, I want you to consider yourself invited to go deeper so that we can take ground even faster. Most of us will not be called into vocational ministry. Bob Kern was not a pastor or overseas missionary. God made him to be an engineer. And boy, was he. He made a boatload of money, and then he gave it away so that the whole world might know about Jesus. And most of us won't give away $1 billion. Although I will say, if you have $1 billion that is burning a hole in your pocket, you come find me afterwards, and I will buy you coffee, okay? And we'll talk more. That is not most of us. Instead, for most of us, generosity will look like faithful giving on moderate salaries. But if we do that together, just watch and see how we can move the needle on some really incredible things. Jesus said the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. That is good news. The harvest is plentiful. Jesus said there's ground to take, and we get to be a part of it. So today, I want you to consider, how is God calling you to live with even more open hands? How is God calling you to step even deeper into generosity? One of our elders said this week, I love this, we don't just give gifts, we bring our gifts. Because when we give, we are just returning to God what he has already given to us. Isn't that great? The gospel means that we don't practice generosity to earn God's love. Full stop. God loves and accepts us fully in Christ, and when we practice generosity, it is always a response to his generosity. Here's a simple way I can put it. When it comes to generosity, Jesus is our foundation, our model, and our means. He gave his life for us. He is the example to us, and it is his power in us that cultivates generosity in our world. Jesus is the one who greets even the most wayward of sinners, not with a judgmental, "Where have you been?" but with a warm welcome home. Jesus is the one who lived with truly open hands, hands that were so open, in fact, that they were nailed to the cross for your sake and mine. And Jesus is the one who didn't just offer forgiveness and new life to the world, but also dignifies you and me with an invitation to be disciples with him on mission for the sake of the world. And so, friends, may it be true of us. May it be true of us that as we spend more time in the company of Jesus, that we would actually become more like him. And as we actually become more like him, we too would offer our whole selves for the sake of the world.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on our YouTube channel today. I hope that you felt the welcome home of Christ right through your screen. Here we believe that the gospel is good news worth sharing. So if you'd like to share this stream with your friends and family, you can also subscribe to this channel, and you can use @BridgeChurchTN. Also, if you'd like to give, there's a link in the description there you can click, and it'll walk you through all the steps. And if you'd like to stay connected with us, you can simply head on over to bridge.tv. Hope to see you again soon.